Alison is going to give a presentation with the title Gender Anomalies in a Biographical Database. She is a professor of English at the University of Virginia and the academic director of the Scholars Lab in the library at the University of Virginia, and a longtime friend and colleague. So over to you, Alison.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Daniel and Jerry, for inviting me and Susan Brown. And I'm going to share my screen, and all things will become clear when that starts happening. And I think you can see that and hear me. I hope people can hear me. Great. So yeah, Daniel mentions our collaboration, and this, I will be talking about a project that I owe a lot to Daniel for, and you'll see that it has been a collaboration with SNAC. So I am not an archivist, but I am a SNAC collaborator and user of SNAC. I'm often steering students to go find what they can do with SNAC. Partly, I co-direct a graduate digital humanities certificate at the University of Virginia, and students need good examples of the way that research data can be better accessed and turned into meaningful interpretation. So the collective biographies of women, I believe I saw Worthy Martin on the list of people. And then of course, Daniel, way back when I had a fellowship at the Institute for, at IF, Institute of Advanced Technology and the Humanities, Daniel helped devise a schema, and Worthy and I and other people have been working to make basically what was a bibliography, a searchable online bibliography, into much more of a complicated resource. And so it has two different sort of generations. Part of it was at the Scholars Lab, and then the other part, the more recent part, is at IF. And if you really want to know all the people I'm indebted to, even a partial list is pretty long, and it's at IF, at that site that you see on your screen. The principle behind it is a study of a genre of publication that was really quite widespread, even though feminist scholars sort of didn't seem to notice it. Collections of short biographies of women, not encyclopedias, not reference works, often really illustrated, well-narrated stories about historical women, sometimes semi-legendary, but generally nonfiction, and making a database out of all the ones that we found published from 1830 to 1940 in English. So even some in India, some in Australia, or Ireland, you know, then of course in the United States, publishing is all over to Buffalo, and it leads to quite a complicated set of people, over 8,500, many of whom have multiple chapters about them. So that becomes interesting. How are they told differently over time? And we were interested in the bibliographical information as well. So all that is relational data, and it's all based on a book I published, which is a reverse of the usual pattern. People usually write some book after they've already done the digital work. So I'm here today. I'll say a few things about prosopography as I'm getting started, and then I want to just show you some of the things that CBW, Collective Biographies of Women, has done with gender. And it's only one example of the many complexities of representing people in commensurate ways in databases, in archives, in anything that's interoperable data. Obviously, always a distortion. You know, you're telling me I can be put into any kind of categories. I'm a living person. So obviously, there's the ethics that you're all familiar with about representing individuals, and then obviously having usable terms to group individuals together. Are we working towards recognition, or are we just reducing people to data? And with gender, of course, it's been very common to think in binary terms, and it's almost irresistible. So Susan Brown had a phrase I really liked in an essay that I helped to co-edit, to be categorically provisional. And it looks like it's actually also in her title for today. And I had given a talk about strategic typologies. So typologies seeming to be impossible to avoid. And I was just echoing the feminist idea of strategic essentialism. We still need the category woman, even though we've deconstructed it to the point where we realize it's a social construct and it's not inborn. And I just chose a screenshot of a recent article, recent enough, on the hot topic of gender nonconformity. How can you possibly be labeling human beings into two gender categories at this point in time? So when I was talking about the Susan Brown's topic of categorically provisional, or my term strategic typologies, we're both trying to deal with the issue of needing categories. And this is well before you're trying to talk about having a database for any kind of feminist theory, any kind of thinking about, if you're a sociologist, you start needing to put people into categories. And this is a distortion and an ethical problem, as you know, as I'm hearing that this session of your annual conference is really addressing that kind of question. And with gender nonconformity being much more in the awareness, we're really not satisfied with male or female as categories. So I was just suggesting that today was a good use of time to talk a little bit about my concept of prosopography or prosopography. Probably a lot of people here have heard of it or know about it. A lot of English professors don't think that much about it, but it is a very widespread phenomenon of personae writing, not just writing about one person, but comparing people. And a sort of reified example of that is Mount Rushmore category, founding father or important US presidents. It becomes a series, and people are constantly wanting to add another face to the face of Mount Rushmore, even though the rock is going to crumble. And even though the whole idea is so corrupt because it's sitting there in native territories with disregarding what was going on in the Dakotas. So these lists that we produce, sometimes in print, sometimes in other ways, national portrait galleries, are really fascinating to me as a kind of rhetoric for how we understand histories, how we understand nations. And prosopography does come from the Greek word for, like persona, for appear, and became understood as being the persona of a visual, but of course it's largely in a written form. And I get interested in the rhetoric of prosopopeia, which is the sort of rhetoric really of archivists, everybody, thinking about how we summon the dead, how we bring them back to life, and the daunting task, because death has always undone so many. Prosopography is how to deal with the many in parallel lives. And by the early 20th century, after years of prosopography among philologists and classicists, historians started to use it. So they would study all the members of parliament in 1660 and gather, because there wasn't that much known about each of them, but gather more information by the comparison across many. And that is where you understand the analogy with thinking about a lot of database projects these days. Digital humanities often trying to make up for lack of granular individual data. You gather more of a kind of life pattern by comparing large populations, but doing it, we hope, in an ethical and not distorting way. SNAC is, of course, prosopography. And CBW and SNAC records, we got an NEH grant to connect them. We only piloted connecting all of the person records in CBW with SNAC. So we're in this kind of ethical dilemma, really, of who does what to whom. We, as archivists, or I, as a researcher, want to represent the historical women who are in these biographies, that are in these books, responsibly. But they are not there to say, I want to self-identify as an African-American woman dentist. The book I'm in, someone has labeled me African-American, everyone has considered me female, and there's records to show that I was a dentist, but I'm not here to say that's what I want to be. And that's a problem of agency. Persons who are in these printed books have already been framed and labeled. Usually that we don't see any downside to that, because otherwise most people are forgotten. And often it's done by friends or by supporters. It's not necessarily harming. But it's rarely, in the books that I look at, rarely is it based on any kind of archival research, often hearsay. And who are we to come along and say where to place them? How do we study them? So as a group, the CBW people, we try to read as sensibly as possible what was the intention of the people who put the book together. So, and they seem to be, we can guess, addressing implied audiences. So there are collections, all African-American women, 3 of them published in 1893, absolutely very clear from the prefatory material, from the tables of contents, that this is a community effort addressed to African-American readers, with a certain amount in the preface addressing the nation at large about the accomplishments of that race. I don't have, I think that is a pretty safe situation for us to interpret in terms of race. But the why of the representing women is not always self-evident from the books. We try to go from what the books seem to indicate. Here is a book called Great Wives and Mothers, and it had a publishing history first in 1917, 1927. And you can see, if you can see, I don't know how big your slide vision is, but it begins with the matrons of the early church. It goes way, way back in time. But as the chronological contents goes forward, I realized by looking and reading more about these names that all the people in the book are Catholic. Nothing in the paratext says these are Catholic women, but we feel fairly confident talking about religious models. These are our terms of categorizing this book. We don't have a term Catholic, but with religious models, and we can put in notes that all these women, and being Catholic is not something that just sort of leaps out at you when you know their names, but Saint Monica, of course, we consider her Catholic. So you can see how the categories change as far as what we can understand from them over time. Gender anomalies in a biographical database. Of course, I, being a 21st century person, am really interested in Mary Read. There she is in SNAC. If you see at the blue link to your SNAC records, it's probably several on Mary Read. She went by several names. These are our types: adventure, cross-dresser. Those are our controlled vocabularies that people have added to the database. You can find persons within 1 degree of separation of Mary Read and 2 short biographies of Mary Read. Dressed as a woman, she is absolutely historical, and yet there isn't a single story I've read that isn't also completely wonderful. And, Pirates of the Caribbean, yes, comes from there. Here you go, SNAC, Mary Read, cross-referencing to collective biographies of women, with a reference into that book, Wild Women of History. What have we called Mary Read? We have lots of typologies that we can, control vocabularies again, that we can use to help approximate what Mary Read means. Adventurous, there are 36 of them in CVW, member 8,500 people. So some statistical measuring there. Cross-dressing, not rare, lots of military women. And then we tried to get at, instead of just sort of saying, obviously she slept around or some kind of, we could use all kinds of negative terminology, but just that's a very 21st century way of talking about things. And we're trying to use our own terms. When you get into all the typologies of all these women in our database, you notice that and you read the text as well, which we have access to. Genius is often considered a gender transgression. So it's sort of, they're almost in the books because they have something that is considered not a female attribute. The race is often tacit. Nobody seems, nationality and occupation are usually announced by the books. But so we're using kind of strategic typologies to notice who is narratable, who gets in these books over time in our database. And really getting near the end of my slides, this is sort of the heart of the matter. We do attribute gender. These books often have women in the title. Very seldom, sometimes they include men because they're a lover, or there's a certain subgenre of chapters about the man and the woman in the same chapter. Most of the subjects are assumed F, but we are pretty confident most of the time in calling the subjects female. We've added gender nonconforming, and there are a few. And that, remember that these books were published up through 1940, not necessarily searching for great lesbians of history, which is something we've been doing since 1970 or so. Male, transgender, and unknown. There will be subjects in there whose names, we haven't been able to access the text or read the text, and there's no use of pronouns within the narrative. And then anonymous authors, obviously, we would have to label as not unknown. So I will stop there and hope that there's some questions, I can talk further, but I don't feel like I'm bringing, I hope I'm not bringing coals to Newcastle. I hope I'm not bringing shattering news, because I know you're very interested in trying to think these things through. And this small scale resource benefits enormously from leading people from what they find in CBW out to a resource like SNAC, links to HathiTrust, and trying to be a pathway for researchers to identify the same person. And as a footnote, all of our person IDs have been matched into Wikidata. So it's as a table in Wikidata, even if there is no page for the person, you could find a CBW person, and we could do a hackathon, an editathon on that. So that's the URL of the site that Worthy and Daniel and I worked on, and really leaving you with a question: can we ethically provide access to the 19th century's way of labeling people? I promise you, reading these books, you might feel, why go back to this particular unregenerate way of representing women? But I promise you, you would be surprised too. Wide flexibility in women's roles. Absolutely not telling you that everyone should be a wife and mother. And are we, when we have a user use CBW, are they going to know when they're encountering our labels? I would think gender agency, sexual agency is clearly not contemporary with a 19th century text. What will happen to our labels? Our labels are certainly going to be anachronistic. So are we as humble as we ought to be, because the past had their ways of labeling people? We know we can correct them now, but can we foresee being corrected in the future? Thanks.